I woke up that Tuesday morning to the sound of an engine roaring through my cornfield, and I knew exactly who it was before I even opened my eyes. For the third time that week, Brenda Patterson from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had decided that my property was her personal shortcut to avoid the main road traffic. I threw on my jeans and work boots, stumbling out onto my porch just in time to see her silver Mercedes SUV cutting a fresh path through rows of nearly mature corn that I had spent the entire spring planting and tending. My name is Andrew Orson, and I have been farming this land in rural Nebraska, just outside of Lincoln, for the better part of 15 years. The property had been in my family for 3 generations before me, and I took pride in maintaining the traditions my grandfather had started. The cornfield in question was a solid 40 acres of prime agricultural land, positioned right along the border of my farm and the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision that had sprung up about 7 years ago. When they first broke ground on that development, I had my concerns, but I figured live and let live. I never imagined that one of their residents would develop the audacity to treat my working farm like her personal highway. Brenda Patterson was everything you would expect from a stereotypical HOA president. She was in her late 40s, always dressed in athleisure where that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. And she had that particular haircut that seemed to be issued along with the HOA gavel. You know the one. The short, heavily highlighted bob that screamed, "I would like to speak to your manager," from 100 yards away. She drove that Mercedes like she owned every road in Lancaster County, and apparently she had decided that included my cornfield too. The first time it happened, I thought maybe it was an accident. Perhaps her GPS had malfunctioned, or she had taken a wrong turn in the early morning darkness. I was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. But then it happened again 2 days later, and then again, and by the fourth occurrence, I realized this was not a mistake. This was intentional. Brenda had figured out that by cutting diagonally through my cornfield, she could shave about 15 minutes off her morning commute into Lincoln, where she worked as some kind of real estate consultant. I called her the first time I confirmed it was intentional. I got her number from the Meadowbrook Estates directory that they had sent around when they first built the neighborhood, trying to be good neighbors and introduce themselves. The irony of that was not lost on me now. "Hello." Her voice had been clipped and impatient when she answered. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Andrew Orson. I own the farm adjacent to your neighborhood. I need to talk to you about driving through my cornfield." There was a pause, and I could practically hear her eyes rolling. "Oh, that." "Listen, Andrew, I am in a terrible rush every morning and the main road is just impossibly congested. I am barely cutting through a tiny corner of your field. You have plenty of corn. That tiny corner represents thousands of dollars in crop damage," I said, keeping my voice level. "Every time you drive through, you are destroying plants that would have produced harvestable corn. Not to mention you are creating ruts that make it difficult for my equipment to operate safely." "I think you are being a bit dramatic," she said. "It is just a few stalks here and there. Besides, have you considered that maybe if you were not growing your crops so close to a residential area, this would not be an issue? The HOA has actually been discussing the unsightliness of having a commercial farm operation so close to our homes. We might need to file a complaint with the county." I felt my jaw tighten. "Madam, my family has been farming this land since 1957. Your neighborhood has been there for 7 years. I am not the one encroaching on anyone." "Well, I really do not have time for this conversation," she said. "I am sure we can work something out. Maybe you could create a proper road through your property that we could use. It would benefit everyone." "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "Mrs. Patterson, I am asking you politely to stop driving through my field. If it continues, I will have to take further action." She made a sound that was half laugh, half scoff. "Further action? What are you going to do exactly? File a complaint? Good luck with that. My brother-in-law is a county commissioner. Now, if you will excuse me, I have actual important matters to attend to." She hung up before I could respond. That conversation had taken place 3 weeks ago, and not only had Brenda continued her daily joyrides through my corn, but she had actually started using the path more frequently. Some mornings, I would see her cutting through at dawn, and then again in the evening on her way back home. She had worn a definite track through the field now, a muddy scar cutting diagonally across the neat rows that I had so carefully planted and cultivated. I documented everything, of course. I took photographs with timestamps showing the tire tracks, the destroyed corn stalks, and the erosion that was beginning to develop along her makeshift road. I researched property law and trespassing statutes in Nebraska. I even consulted with my insurance agent about whether my farm liability policy would cover legal action. Every resource I checked confirmed what I already knew. Brenda was absolutely in the wrong, and I had every right to stop her. But here is the thing about dealing with people like Brenda Patterson. They do not operate on the same wavelength as reasonable folks. They have spent so much time in positions of petty authority, making rules about fence colors and mailbox heights, that they genuinely believe the world should bend to their convenience. Laws and property rights do not apply to them because they have never faced real consequences for their actions. I decided I needed to escalate things, but I wanted to be smart about it. I drove into town and met with Sheriff Tom Hendricks, who I had known since high school. Tom listened patiently as I explained the situation, nodding sympathetically as I showed him the photographs on my phone. "That is definitely trespassing," he said, leaning back in his chair. "And the property damage is pretty clear-cut too. You want me to go talk to her? I would appreciate it," I said. "I have tried handling it directly, but she is not taking me seriously." Tom made the visit that afternoon. I was not there for the conversation, but he called me later that evening to fill me in. "Well, I talked to Mrs. Patterson," he said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. She was not exactly receptive to the message. She kept insisting that she had a right to use that route because there was no fence or barrier, and that you had not properly posted no trespassing signs. She also mentioned something about her brother-in-law being a county commissioner. "Yeah, she threw that at me too," I said. For what it is worth, I explained very clearly that Nebraska is a fence-out state, not a fence-in state, meaning you have no obligation to fence your property to prevent trespassing. I also told her that you have every right to press charges if she continues. But between you and me, Andrew, I do not think it made much of an impact. She is one of those folks who thinks rules are for other people. "So, what do you recommend?" Tom sighed. "Put up some no trespassing signs along that route, the legal kind with the proper wording and size. That way, if she does it again, it is criminal trespassing rather than just civil. That gives me more authority to actually do something about it. You could also consider installing a gate or some kind of barrier." I thanked Tom and hung up, feeling frustrated but not surprised. The next day, I drove to the farm supply store and bought a dozen heavy-duty no trespassing signs that met all of Nebraska's legal requirements. I spent the afternoon installing them along the route that Brenda had been taking, spacing them exactly as the law specified. I made sure they were clearly visible and impossible to miss. The following morning, at precisely 6:15, I heard the familiar sound of Brenda's Mercedes engine. I walked out to the edge of my property line, just in time to see her barrel right past the brand new no trespassing signs without even slowing down. She saw me standing there and actually had the audacity to wave as she went by, like we were old friends, and she was not actively destroying my property and ignoring clearly posted legal warnings. That was when I decided that polite measures were not going to work. If Brenda wanted to play games, I would play games too, but I was going to make sure I won. I spent the next few days researching and planning. I consulted with my lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen who had handled my grandfather's estate and various farm legal matters over the years. I explained the situation and asked her what my options were. "You have every right to protect your property," Patricia said. "The fact that the sheriff has already warned her and you have posted legal signage means you are on solid ground. What are you thinking about doing?" "I want to block her path," I said. "Make it impossible for her to keep using my field as her personal shortcut. But I want to do it in a way that is completely legal and that does not give her any ammunition to come back at me." Patricia thought about it for a moment. "You could install a fence, obviously, but that is expensive and time-consuming. You could also place barriers like large rocks or logs across the path. As long as they are on your property and you are not creating a hazard that extends onto public roads or her property, you are within your rights. Just make sure whatever you do, it is clearly on your land, and you are not blocking any legitimate easements or right-of-ways." "There are no easements," I confirmed. "I have checked the property survey multiple times. Her route cuts across land that is 100% mine." "Then you are good to go," Patricia said. "Just document everything. Take photos before and after, keep records of all your communications, and make sure you are not doing anything that could be construed as creating a public hazard." With Patricia's blessing, I formulated my plan. I was not going to build a fence, because that would be expensive and Brenda did not deserve to cost me thousands of dollars. Instead, I was going to use resources I already had available on the farm. I owned a couple of large pieces of farming equipment that were old and no longer in regular use. I also had access to some very large hay bales, the round ones that weighed about 1,000 pounds each, and I had several pieces of heavy timber that I had been saving for a construction project that never materialized. I waited until the weekend when I knew Brenda would not be making her morning drive. Then, I got to work. I fired up my old tractor and started hauling equipment and materials to strategic positions along Brenda's route. I placed 2 of the massive round hay bales at the point where she entered my field from the subdivision side, positioning them close enough together that her Mercedes could not fit between them, but leaving enough space that my own equipment could navigate around them if needed. Then, about halfway along her usual route, I positioned an old non-working combine harvester that had been sitting in my equipment barn for the better part of a decade. That machine was a beast, weighing several tons, and it was not going anywhere without serious heavy equipment to move it. Finally, at the far end of the route where Brenda usually exited back onto the public road, I created a barrier using the heavy timber, stacking the logs in a formation that was impossible to drive over or around. I topped it off with another 2 hay bales for good measure. When I was finished, I stepped back and admired my handiwork. Brenda's shortcut had become an obstacle course that would require either a tank or a helicopter to navigate. I took extensive photographs of everything, making sure to capture the positions of all the barriers and confirming with my GPS app that everything was well within my property lines. Then I went home, had a beer, and waited for Monday morning. I did not have to wait long. At 6:17 on Monday morning, I heard the sound I had been anticipating. Brenda's Mercedes approaching the field, followed by the unmistakable sound of her slamming on her brakes. I allowed myself a small smile as I poured my coffee and listened to what happened next. There was a long silence, then I heard her car door open and close. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize, but I answered anyway. "What the hell did you do?" Brenda's voice was shrill with anger. "You blocked the road." "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," I said calmly. "I did not block any road. I placed equipment and materials on my private property, which I have every legal right to do. The path you have been using is not a road. It is my cornfield." "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "You cannot just block off access like this." "I have places to be." "Then I suggest you use the public roads like everyone else," I said. "The main road is right there, just like it has always been. That adds 10 miles to my commute," she said, and I could hear the genuine outrage in her voice, like I had committed some kind of unforgivable crime against her. "Then you should have thought about that before you ignored my requests to stop trespassing, ignored the sheriff's warning, and ignored the multiple no trespassing signs I installed," I said. "This is not a public thoroughfare, Mrs. Patterson. It is my property, and you do not have permission to be on it." "We will see about this," she said. "The HOA board is going to hear about this, and we will be taking action. You cannot just do whatever you want." "Actually, on my own property, I can do whatever I want as long as it is legal," I said. "Have a nice day, Mrs. Patterson." I hung up and went about my morning routine, feeling more satisfied than I had in weeks. I knew this was not over, not by a long shot. Brenda was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. But I had taken my stand, and I had done it the right way, legally and deliberately. Whatever came next, I was ready for it. It turned out I did not have to wait long for the next phase of Brenda's campaign. That very afternoon, I received a certified letter from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I signed for it and opened it right there at my mailbox, curious about what kind of legal nonsense they were going to try to throw at me. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead and signed by Brenda Patterson in her capacity as HOA president. It informed me that the HOA board had voted to declare my farming operations a nuisance to the community. The letter cited numerous alleged violations, including excessive noise from farm equipment, odors from fertilizer, dust pollution, and unsightly equipment storage. It demanded that I cease all farming operations within 500 feet of the property line I shared with the Meadowbrook Estates, and it threatened legal action if I did not comply within 30 days. I read the letter twice, feeling my blood pressure rise with each ridiculous claim. The noise from my equipment was minimal and only occurred during normal daytime hours. The fertilizers I used were standard agricultural products, and any odor was temporary, and certainly no worse than what anyone could smell driving past any farm in Nebraska. The dust was a natural result of farming and was not excessive by any measure. And the equipment storage accusation was particularly galling because my barn and equipment areas were neat, well-maintained, and nowhere near their subdivision. This letter had nothing to do with legitimate complaints and everything to do with Brenda retaliating because I had blocked her illegal shortcut. The problem for Brenda was that she had fundamentally misunderstood the legal relationship between her HOA and my property. Homeowners associations have authority over properties within their jurisdiction, but my farm was not part of Meadowbrook Estates. I had never signed any HOA agreement, never paid any HOA dues, and never agreed to be bound by any of their rules. They had exactly zero authority over what I did on my land. I called Patricia Chen again and read her the letter over the phone. "Oh, this is good," Patricia said, and I could hear the amusement in her voice. "They have really stepped in it now. This is harassment, pure and simple. They have no jurisdiction over your property, and threatening legal action based on these fabricated complaints could actually expose them to liability." "So what should I do?" I asked. "Let me draft a response," Patricia said. "I am going to make it very clear that they have no authority here, and that if they continue this harassment, we will pursue legal action against the HOA and Mrs. Patterson personally. This is actually great for your position, because it establishes a clear pattern of retaliatory behavior." Patricia sent her response letter the next day, and it was a thing of beauty. In precise legal language, she demolished every claim in the HOA's letter, cited multiple statutes protecting agricultural operations in Nebraska, and made it abundantly clear that any further harassment would result in a lawsuit. She also specifically mentioned the documented trespassing incidents, and suggested that Brenda's behavior could be construed as using her HOA position to pursue a personal vendetta, which could create liability for the entire HOA board. I thought that might be the end of it, but I had underestimated Brenda's determination and her willingness to make things worse for herself. 2 days after Patricia sent her letter, I woke up to find that someone had spray-painted graffiti on the side of my barn. The words "Move your junk" were sprawled in bright orange paint across the weathered wood siding that my grandfather had installed 60 years ago. I was furious, but I was also smart enough to know that I needed to handle this properly. I called Sheriff Tom Hendricks immediately and waited for him to arrive before touching anything. Tom showed up within an hour, took photographs, and examined the scene carefully. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already had a pretty good idea. "I have a strong suspicion," I said, "but I did not see it happen, so I cannot prove anything." Tom nodded. "Given the wording and the timing coming right after the HOA letter, I think we can make some educated guesses. I am going to file a report for vandalism and criminal mischief." "Do you have any security cameras?" "Not currently," I said, "but I am going to fix that immediately." "Good idea," Tom said. "In the meantime, keep documenting everything. I will go have another conversation with Mrs. Patterson, though I doubt she will admit to anything." That afternoon, I drove to Lincoln and bought a complete security camera system. I spent the rest of the day installing cameras covering my barn, my equipment areas, my driveway, and most importantly, the section of my cornfield where Brenda had been trespassing. The system was wireless, high definition, and had night vision capabilities. Everything recorded to cloud storage so that even if someone destroyed the cameras, the footage would be preserved. It was an expense I had not planned for, but it was going to be worth it. Sure enough, 2 nights later, my new security system paid for itself. At just past midnight, the motion detection alert started going off on my phone. I pulled up the camera app and watched in real time as a silver Mercedes SUV pulled up to the hay bale barriers I had installed. Brenda got out of the car, and for a moment I thought maybe she was just going to stand there and yell at the hay bales, which would have been entertaining enough. But then she opened her trunk and pulled out what looked like a can of gasoline. I was already dialing 911 as I watched her douse one of the hay bales with fuel. The dispatcher answered, and I quickly explained what was happening, giving my address and emphasizing that someone was attempting to commit arson on my property. The dispatcher assured me that deputies were on their way and told me to stay inside and keep myself safe. On my phone screen, I watched Brenda light a match and toss it onto the hay bale. The flames caught immediately, roaring up into the night sky. Hay bales burn hot and fast, and within seconds the fire was blazing. Brenda stood there for a moment, watching her handiwork, and then she seemed to realize the magnitude of what she had just done. She ran back to her Mercedes and sped away, her taillights disappearing into the darkness. I grabbed my fire extinguisher and ran outside, but I knew immediately that it was not going to be enough. The hay bale was fully engulfed, and the flames were starting to spread to the dry corn stalks nearby. I ran back inside and called the volunteer fire department while I started dragging a hose from my barn toward the fire. In the distance, I could already hear sirens approaching. The next hour was chaos. The volunteer fire department arrived and managed to contain the blaze before it spread too far into the cornfield. But I lost about half an acre of crop along with both hay bales and some of the timber I had used for the barrier. The sheriff's deputies arrived while the firefighters were still working, and I showed them the security footage on my phone. Even in the darkness and through the slightly grainy night vision, Brenda's face was clearly visible, as was her license plate. "Well, that is pretty cut and dried," Deputy Martinez said as he watched the video. "That is arson, criminal mischief, and we can probably add reckless endangerment to the list. We are going to go pick her up right now." I watched the deputy cars drive away, feeling a strange mix of emotions. I had not wanted things to escalate this far. All I had ever wanted was for Brenda to stop driving through my cornfield. But she had pushed and pushed, refusing to accept reasonable boundaries, and now she was facing serious criminal charges. The firefighters finished their work around 3 in the morning. The fire chief, a weathered man named Bob Kowalski who had gone to school with my father, clapped me on the shoulder as they were packing up. "You got lucky, Andrew," he said. "If you had not caught this when you did, if that fire had spread into the dry corn with the wind picking up, we could have lost your whole field and maybe some structures too. That woman should be grateful. She is only facing arson charges and not being responsible for burning down your farm or getting someone killed." I thanked Bob and his crew for their quick response, and then I spent the rest of the night sitting on my porch, too wired to sleep, watching the sun come up over the damaged section of my field. The charred remains of the hay bales smoldered in the early morning light, sending thin streams of smoke into the pink and gold sky. My phone rang around 7 in the morning. It was Patricia Chen. "I just heard from a friend in the sheriff's office," she said. "They arrested Brenda Patterson last night for arson. Andrew, this changes everything. This is not just a civil property dispute anymore. This is serious criminal behavior." "I know," I said, feeling tired to my bones. "I have been up all night dealing with it. Are you okay?" "Is the damage extensive?" I explained the situation and the extent of the fire damage. Patricia listened and then was quiet for a moment. "We need to move quickly on the civil side while this is fresh," she said. "I am going to file for a restraining order first thing this morning, and we are also going to pursue a civil lawsuit for the property damage, the trespassing, the vandalism to your barn, and the arson. Between the criminal charges and the civil suit, Mrs. Patterson is going to be dealing with the consequences of her actions for a very long time." "What about the HOA?" I asked. "Are they liable for any of this?" "That is an interesting question," Patricia said. "We can definitely make an argument that Brenda was abusing her position as HOA president to pursue this personal vendetta, and that the harassment letter the HOA sent was part of that pattern. I think we can hold the HOA partially liable, which means their insurance will probably get involved." "That is actually good for you because HOA insurance policies typically have deeper pockets than individual defendants." Over the next few weeks, the situation developed in ways I could never have anticipated. Brenda was formally charged with second-degree arson, criminal mischief, and trespassing. The county prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Jennifer Wu, took the case very seriously, especially after she saw the security footage and learned about the pattern of escalating behavior that had led up to the arson. The restraining order was granted immediately, prohibiting Brenda from coming within 500 feet of my property. The civil lawsuit moved forward as well, with Patricia filing claims for property damage, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The HOA's insurance company tried to deny coverage initially, arguing that Brenda's actions were personal and not related to her HOA duties. But Patricia had documented the harassment letter and was able to establish a clear connection. Eventually, the insurance company agreed to participate in settlement discussions, but the most interesting development came from within the Meadowbrook Estates community itself. It turned out that not everyone in the subdivision was a fan of Brenda Patterson's leadership style. Once news of her arrest spread through the neighborhood, which happened with impressive speed in the age of social media and neighborhood gossip, several residents reached out to me to apologize for her behavior and to distance themselves from her actions. One couple, Dan and Marie Foster, actually drove out to my farm to speak with me in person. They were both in their 60s, retired teachers who had moved to Meadowbrook Estates a few years earlier looking for a quiet place to spend their retirement. "We wanted you to know that not everyone in our neighborhood supports what Brenda did," Dan said as we sat on my porch drinking iced tea. "In fact, most of us are horrified. We love living next to a working farm. It is part of the rural character that attracted us to this area in the first place." "Brenda has always been difficult," Marie added. "She is constantly trying to implement new rules and fines people for the smallest violations. Last year she tried to fine us $100 because our mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Not the wrong color, mind you, but the wrong shade. She had a paint chip chart and everything." "How did she even become HOA president?" I asked. Dan laughed ruefully. "Nobody else wanted the job. She ran unopposed 3 years in a row. Most people just wanted to live their lives without dealing with HOA politics, but Brenda thrives on that stuff. She loves having authority and enforcing rules. Well, her authority is not going to extend very far once this is all resolved," I said. "The criminal charges alone are serious, and the civil suit is going to cost her significantly." "Good," Marie said firmly. "I know that sounds harsh, but she could have killed someone with that fire. She needs to face consequences." The Fosters were not the only ones to reach out. Over the next few days, I received calls, emails, and even a few more personal visits from Meadowbrook Estates residents expressing their support and their embarrassment about the situation. Several of them mentioned that they were organizing to either recall Brenda from the HOA board or to dissolve and reform the board entirely. The community that Brenda had ruled with an iron fist and a paint chip chart was in open revolt. The criminal case moved through the system with surprising speed. Brenda's attorney tried to argue that she had been under extreme stress and that her actions were out of character, but the security footage was damning, and the prosecutor had documented the entire pattern of escalating behavior. In late August, about 4 months after the arson, Brenda accepted a plea deal rather than go to trial. She pled guilty to attempted arson and criminal mischief in exchange for the trespassing charges being dropped. The sentencing hearing was held on a sweltering Tuesday morning in early September. I drove to the Lancaster County Courthouse in Lincoln and sat in the gallery as Brenda stood before Judge Robert Thornton. She looked diminished somehow, smaller than the imperious figure who had waved at me while driving through my cornfield. Her attorney made a statement about how she had learned her lesson and was seeking counseling, and how she was deeply remorseful for her actions. Then, it was my turn to speak. Judge Thornton invited me to address the court with a victim impact statement. I stood up, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on me, and walked to the podium. "Your Honor," I began, "my family has been farming our land for 3 generations. My grandfather worked that soil. My father worked that soil. I work that soil. It is not just property to me. It is my livelihood, my heritage, and my home. When Mrs. Patterson decided that her convenience was more important than my rights, when she repeatedly trespassed and destroyed my crops, I tried to handle it reasonably. I called her directly. I contacted the sheriff. I posted legal signage. I did everything right, everything by the book." I paused, making sure my voice stayed steady, and in response she escalated. She harassed me through the HOA. She vandalized my property, and then she tried to burn it down. That fire could have spread. It could have destroyed my entire harvest, my barn, my home. It could have spread to the neighboring properties, including the very subdivision Mrs. Patterson lives in. Her actions were not just criminal, they were reckless and dangerous to an entire community. Judge Thornton nodded, making notes as I spoke. I continued, "I am not a vindictive person, Your Honor, but I need to know that my property is safe and that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. I need to know that when someone repeatedly breaks the law and then commits arson, there will be real consequences." I sat back down, and Judge Thornton reviewed his notes before pronouncing sentence. He sentenced Brenda to 2 years in county jail, with 18 months suspended, meaning she would serve 6 months with the possibility of work release after 60 days. She also received 5 years of probation, was ordered to pay full restitution for all property damage, which Patricia had calculated at just over $15,000, and was required to complete 200 hours of community service. Additionally, she was ordered to have no contact with me and to stay away from my property. As the bailiff led Brenda away to begin serving her sentence, I felt a sense of closure but not triumph. The situation had gone so far beyond where it needed to be. If Brenda had just listened the first time I called her, if she had simply driven the extra 10 miles like everyone else had to do, none of this would have happened. She would not be going to jail. I would not have lost crops and property, and we all could have just lived our lives in peace. The civil lawsuit was resolved a few weeks later through a settlement negotiation. The HOA's insurance company agreed to pay $75,000 to cover the property damage, legal fees, and compensation for my time and distress. Brenda was personally liable for an additional $25,000 in punitive damages, which would be paid through a payment plan over the next 5 years. Patricia negotiated strongly on my behalf, and I was satisfied with the outcome. The money was nice, do not get me wrong. It allowed me to repair all the damage, upgrade my security systems even further, and make some improvements to my barn and equipment that I had been putting off. But more than the money, I valued the principle of the thing. I had stood up for my rights. I had done everything legally and properly, and justice had been served. The story did not end there, though. The aftermath had some interesting developments that played out over the rest of that year and into the next. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA underwent a complete transformation. The residents held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Brenda from the board effective immediately. They elected a new slate of officers, with Dan Foster becoming the new president. One of the first acts of the new board was to send me a formal letter of apology for Brenda's actions, and to assure me that the HOA respected my property rights and my farming operation. The new HOA board also reached out to me about establishing better communication and relationships between the farm and the subdivision. Dan Foster invited me to attend one of their monthly meetings as a guest to talk about farming operations and to help educate the residents about agricultural life. I was hesitant at first, worried that it might open up new conflicts, but Patricia encouraged me to accept. "It is good community relations," she said, "and it establishes you as a reasonable person who is willing to work with neighbors. That is never a bad thing." So I went to the meeting, which was held in the subdivision's community center, a nice facility with a fireplace and comfortable chairs. About 40 residents attended, which was apparently a record turnout. I gave a short presentation about farming, explaining the cycles of planting and harvesting, discussing the equipment, and why it sometimes makes noise, and talking about sustainable farming practices. The residents asked thoughtful questions, and several of them expressed genuine interest in agriculture and appreciation for having a working farm nearby. "It is nice to have open space preserved," one woman said. "We moved here to get away from suburban sprawl, and your farm is a big part of what makes this area special." At the end of the meeting, Dan Foster presented me with a gift on behalf of the HOA. A nice basket filled with local products and a handwritten card signed by most of the residents, thanking me for being a good neighbor and apologizing again for what had happened. It was a kind gesture, and I appreciated the effort they had made to repair the relationship. Brenda served her 60 days and was released on work release, which meant she could go to her job during the day but had to return to the county jail at night. I never saw her during that time, and I was grateful for that. The restraining order remained in place, and as far as I knew, she had no interest in testing its boundaries. After she completed her jail sentence, she moved out of Meadowbrook Estates entirely. I heard through the grapevine that she had relocated to Omaha, starting over somewhere where people did not know about her criminal conviction. Life returned to normal on the farm, or at least as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. I finished harvesting the corn that fall, and despite the damage from Brenda's trespassing and the fire, I still brought in a respectable yield. The following spring, I planted again, and the field came back strong and healthy. Nature has a way of recovering, given time and care. I used some of the settlement money to install proper fencing along the property line I shared with Meadowbrook Estates. It was a nice, split-rail fence, rustic and attractive, that clearly marked the boundary while still maintaining the rural aesthetic of the area. The residents seemed to appreciate it, and it gave me peace of mind knowing that there was a clear physical barrier now. One unexpected benefit that came from the whole ordeal was increased business for my farm stand. I had always sold sweet corn, tomatoes, and other produce from a small stand at the end of my driveway during the summer months, mostly to neighbors and people passing by. But after the story of what happened got some local press coverage, suddenly more people were stopping by. Some came out of curiosity, wanting to see the farm that had been in the news. Others came to show support, telling me they admired how I had stood my ground and handled the situation properly. I hired a high school kid named Tyler to help run the farm stand during the busy summer months, and we actually did brisk business. People seemed to like the idea of buying from a local farm, especially one with a story behind it. I started expanding what I offered, adding honey from my beehives, fresh eggs from my chicken coop, and eventually some grass-fed beef from cattle I raised. It became a nice supplemental income stream on top of the main crop sales. The relationship with the Meadowbrook Estates community continued to improve. Dan Foster and I became friendly, and we would occasionally meet for coffee to chat about neighborhood issues or just to catch up. The HOA started a community garden program and asked if I would be willing to provide some advice and guidance, which I was happy to do. I gave a couple of workshops on gardening basics, and it was actually enjoyable to share knowledge that had been passed down in my family for generations. One spring afternoon, about 18 months after the whole incident with Brenda, I was working in the barn when a car pulled up my driveway. I walked out to see who it was and was surprised to find Marie Foster getting out of her sedan. She waved and walked over with a covered dish in her hands. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said. "I wanted to bring you some homemade apple pie. I used apples from our tree, and I remembered you mentioning you liked pie when we first came to visit." "That is very kind of you," I said, accepting the dish. The pie was still warm and smelled incredible. "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" We sat on my porch, eating pie and drinking coffee, and Marie filled me in on the latest neighborhood news. The HOA was running smoothly under Dan's leadership. They had revised their rules to be more reasonable and less nitpicky. Several new families had moved in, attracted by the community's proximity to Lincoln and its rural setting. "I wanted to tell you something," Marie said after a while. "When we first moved to Meadowbrook, Brenda told us that you were a difficult neighbor. She said you were stubborn and uncooperative, and that you had fought against the development of the subdivision. She painted this picture of you as someone who resented us all being there." I was surprised but not entirely shocked. None of that is true. I had some concerns when the subdivision was first proposed, mainly about water runoff and property lines, but I never fought against it, and I certainly never had any issues with the residents. "We know that now," Marie said, "but for a long time we believed her version of things. She was the HOA president, and we assumed she was telling the truth. It was not until everything happened that we realized Brenda had been lying to us about a lot of things. She had been creating conflicts where none needed to exist. I think she thrived on drama and control." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked gently. Marie looked out across the fields, watching the wind move through the young corn plants that were just starting to grow tall. "Because I wanted you to know that we are sorry. Not just for what Brenda did, but for believing her stories without ever bothering to come meet you ourselves and form our own opinions. We should have been better neighbors from the start." "I appreciate that," I said, "but it all worked out in the end. And I am glad we have a good relationship now." "So are we," Marie said with a warm smile. As time went on, the incident faded from the forefront of everyone's minds, becoming just another story in the history of the farm and the community. I continued farming, the seasons turning in their eternal cycle of planting and harvest. The cornfield where Brenda had driven her illegal shortcut grew back full and strong, with no trace of the damage she had caused. The section that had burned was replanted, and within a year you could not tell anything had ever happened there. I thought about the lessons I had learned through the whole experience. There was the obvious one about standing up for your rights and not letting people walk all over you. But there were subtler lessons too, about the importance of documentation, about following legal procedures, and about the value of having good counsel and support. Patricia Chen had been invaluable throughout the process, and Sheriff Tom Hendricks had taken my complaints seriously, when he could have just dismissed them as a neighbor dispute. I also learned something about community and how conflicts can either tear people apart or bring them together. The Meadowbrook Estates residents could have circled the wagons around Brenda, defending her because she was one of their own. Instead, they chose to hold her accountable and to reach out in friendship. That took courage and character, and I respected them for it. One day in late summer, about 2 years after everything had happened, I was running the farm stand when a young couple pulled up with a toddler in the backseat. They got out and started looking at the produce, and I walked over to help them. "First time visiting?" I asked. "Yes," the woman said. "We just moved to Meadowbrook Estates last month. One of our neighbors told us we had to come check out your farm stand. She said you have the best sweet corn in the county." "I do not know about the best," I said with a laugh, "but I take pride in what I grow. Where did you folks move from?" "We were living in downtown Lincoln," the man said, "but we wanted more space for our daughter to grow up. We love the community out here. It feels like real Nebraska, you know. Not too suburban, not too isolated. And having a working farm nearby was actually a selling point for us." As I helped them pick out corn and tomatoes, I thought about how much had changed. 2 years ago, the HOA president had seen my farm as an obstacle to be overcome, a nuisance to be eliminated. Now, new families were moving to the area specifically because they valued having a farm nearby. It was a complete reversal, and it felt good. The young couple paid for their produce and thanked me, promising they would be back. As I watched them drive away, I noticed Tyler, my helper, organizing the display of tomatoes. He was a good kid, hard-working and eager to learn. I had started teaching him about farming beyond just running the stand, showing him how to maintain equipment and assess crop health. He had expressed interest in studying agricultural science at the University of Nebraska, and I had encouraged him to pursue it. "Tyler," I called out, "when you are done with that, let's walk the cornfield. I want to check on the northwest section." We spent the next hour walking the rows, examining the corn plants for signs of pests or disease, checking soil moisture, and just generally assessing the health of the crop. It was shaping up to be a good year, with favorable weather and strong plant growth. As we walked, I told Tyler about what had happened with Brenda, the full story that he had only heard bits and pieces of. "So she really tried to burn down your field?" he asked, eyes wide with disbelief. "She really did," I confirmed. "It was a bad situation that kept getting worse because she refused to accept reasonable boundaries." "What would you have done differently?" Tyler asked. "If you could go back, I mean." I thought about that question as we continued walking. Honestly, I do not think I would change much. I tried to handle things properly every step of the way. I communicated directly, I involved law enforcement, I documented everything, and I took reasonable defensive measures. The problem was not with my actions. The problem was that Brenda was not interested in being reasonable. Some people are like that. They are so convinced of their own rightness and their own importance that they cannot see how unreasonable they are being. "But it worked out okay in the end, right?" Tyler said. "It did," I agreed. Justice was served, relationships were repaired, and life moved on. But it cost me time, money, stress, and some sleepless nights. That is the reality of standing up for yourself sometimes. It is not always easy or clean, but it is necessary. We finished the walk and headed back toward the barn. The afternoon sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the fields. In the distance, I could see the rooflines of the Meadowbrook Estates houses, and beyond them, the Lincoln skyline was just visible on the horizon. It was a good view, a peaceful view, and I was grateful that I had fought to protect it. That evening, after Tyler had gone home and I had closed up the farm stand for the day, I sat on my porch with a cold beer and watched the sunset. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dan Foster. The HOA was organizing a fall festival in the community center and wanted to know if I would be willing to provide some pumpkins and corn stalks for decoration, and maybe set up a small farm stand during the event. I texted back that I would be happy to participate. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear in the clear Nebraska sky, I reflected on how far things had come. The cornfield that Brenda had driven through was now thriving and healthy. The relationship between my farm and the subdivision was positive and mutually respectful. And Brenda herself was gone, living a different life somewhere else, hopefully having learned something from the consequences of her actions. I never did find out if Brenda ever thought about what she had done, if she ever really understood how unreasonable and destructive her behavior had been. Part of me hoped that she had genuinely learned and grown from the experience. People can change, and everyone deserves a chance at redemption. But I also knew that some people never learn, never change, and just move on to create new conflicts in new places. The important thing, I decided, was that I had stood my ground. I had protected my property, my rights, and my family's legacy. I had done it legally and properly, without stooping to Brenda's level or engaging in the kind of petty behavior that she had exhibited. And in the end, that integrity mattered more than any settlement check or legal victory. The farm would continue. The seasons would turn. The corn would grow. And I would be here, working the land that my grandfather had worked, maintaining the traditions and the values that had been passed down through generations. That was worth fighting for. That was worth protecting. As I finished my beer and headed inside for the night, I took one last look at the cornfield silhouetted against the starlit sky. The field where Brenda had cut through, where she had caused damage and conflict and eventually committed a crime, was now just a field again. Just corn growing in neat rows, doing what corn does, reaching toward the sun and taking nourishment from the soil. Nature had healed. The community had healed. And I had healed too. The story could have ended so many different ways. If I had not stood up for myself, Brenda would probably still be cutting through my field, and who knows what other boundaries she would have pushed. If I had handled things improperly, retaliating in kind or taking illegal action, I could have been the one facing charges. But I had navigated the situation correctly, and that had made all the difference. I learned that sometimes the right thing to do is not the easiest thing to do. It would have been easier to just let Brenda keep using my field rather than deal with the confrontation and the conflict. But easy is not always right. Sometimes you have to stand up, draw a line, and enforce your boundaries even when it is difficult and uncomfortable. I also learned the value of community and how important it is to not judge an entire group by the actions of one bad actor. The residents of Meadowbrook Estates were good people who had been living under the thumb of a tyrant HOA president. Once they were freed from that and could express their own values and priorities, they turned out to be excellent neighbors. In the end, the story of Brenda Patterson and her illegal shortcut through my cornfield became a cautionary tale in our area. It circulated in HOA meetings, in legal circles, and in farming communities as an example of what happens when people abuse their authority and refuse to respect other people's rights. I heard from friends that it had even been used as a case study in a property law class at the University of Nebraska. But for me, it was just one chapter in the ongoing story of my farm. There would be other challenges, other issues to address, other problems to solve. Farming is not an easy life, and dealing with neighbors and communities is an ongoing process. But I was confident now that I could handle whatever came my way. I had the experience, the knowledge, and the backbone to protect what was mine while still being a good neighbor and a contributing member of the community. The 10-mile detour that Brenda had been so desperate to avoid became symbolic of the much longer and more difficult journey she had to take as a result of her actions. 6 months in jail, 5 years of probation, thousands of dollars in restitution and damages, a criminal record, and the humiliation of being removed from her HOA position, and eventually having to move away from the community. All of that because she could not accept that my property was not her shortcut. It is funny how small decisions can cascade into life-changing consequences. If Brenda had just driven the main road that first day, adding 10 miles to her commute, but respecting the law and my property rights, none of the rest would have happened. But she made a different choice, and then she made another bad choice, and another, each one compounding the previous ones until she found herself lighting a match and committing arson in a desperate attempt to clear the path I had legally blocked. I still drive past the spot where she used to enter my field every day. The hay bales I replaced after the fire sit there now, weathered and natural-looking, more of a gentle marker than an aggressive barrier. The corn grows right up to them, healthy and strong. And every time I pass that spot, I am reminded of the importance of boundaries, both literal and figurative. We all have boundaries, lines that should not be crossed, rights that should be respected. Sometimes those boundaries are tested by people who do not believe the rules apply to them, who think their needs and convenience supersede everyone else's rights. When that happens, we have a choice. We can give in, let them trample our boundaries and teach them that their behavior is acceptable. Or we can stand firm, enforce our rights, and insist on being treated with respect. I chose to stand firm, and I would make that same choice again if I had to. Not out of stubbornness or spite, but out of principle and self-respect. My farm, my land, my family's legacy deserved to be protected. And I was the one responsible for protecting it. As the years went on and the incident faded further into memory, it became just another story I would tell sometimes. Usually when someone asked about the security cameras or noticed the particularly robust fencing along one section of the property line. The story would get compressed in the telling, losing some of the nuance and detail, becoming a simpler narrative about standing up to an unreasonable HOA president who thought she could use my cornfield as her personal highway. But I remembered all of it, every phone call, every letter, every moment of anger and frustration, and every moment of satisfaction when justice was served. Those memories shaped how I approached conflicts and challenges in the future. They made me more aware of my rights, but also more thoughtful about how I exercised them. They taught me the value of documentation and proper procedure, but also the importance of community relationships and choosing battles wisely. My grandfather used to say that farming teaches you patience because you cannot rush the seasons. You plant in spring, tend through summer, harvest in fall, and rest in winter. Each phase has its time and its purpose. The situation with Brenda taught me a different kind of patience, the patience to let the legal system work, to let justice take its course, to trust that doing things the right way would eventually produce the right result. And it did. The corn grows, the farm thrives, the community prospers. And somewhere out there, hopefully, Brenda Patterson learned that shortcuts are not always worth taking, especially when they involve breaking the law and trampling on other people's rights. The 10 miles she was so desperate to avoid cost her far more than she ever could have imagined. And my cornfield, the field that my grandfather planted and my father tended, and that I now nurture, remains exactly where it has always been, productive and protected, a testament to the value of standing your ground and defending what is rightfully yours. The end of the story is really the beginning of the rest of my life, farming my land with the confidence that comes from having faced down a serious challenge and emerged victorious. Every harvest is a little sweeter, every peaceful morning a little more precious, knowing that I fought for this and won. The farm will be here long after I am gone, pass down to whoever comes next, and they will inherit not just the land but the lesson that it is worth fighting to protect what matters. That is the real legacy, more valuable than any settlement check or legal judgment. The knowledge that when your rights are threatened, when your property is invaded, when your boundaries are not respected, you have the strength and the will to stand up and say no. That 10-mile detour Brenda had to drive became permanent because I made sure that my property would never again be mistaken for a public thoroughfare. And that is exactly how it should be.